Hello folk, how you doing, Scotty? I recently just received a nice comment and it's nice to see because I'm someone who basically directs my channel towards these type of folk regarding, things like socialism, capitalism and all the rest of this. This isn't just a problem that's, among Marxists. I try to get my videos out to folk so that people can learn. You've got a lot of folk in society who even vote the likes of conservatives. And I'm thinking to myself, they don't really understand capitalism. And I even once had an argument, and it was a couple of months ago or so like that, and the guy was trying to say that, oh well, state-run fire service is not socialism, and I'm thinking to myself, how can he actually say that? In his head, right, he thinks it's just a case of, oh well, that's only applicable to that of some fully centrally planned economy where, the state runs everything. It applies to any sort of thing, like just as simple as the government centrally planning what the fire service is. Now, socialists, as I says, are idealistic. They're no people who ever accept the real world of socialism, right? So socialists base everything off at theory. That's why socialists will turn around and say to you, oh, the Soviet Union wasn't socialist, or they say, oh, the Soviet Union wasn't the true face of socialism, or whatever they want to use. The thing that even in Christian Yemyet's book, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies, although he doesn't really go into explain about, why socialism failed, he doesn't really go into the details on that. What his book is excellent for is all these hundreds and hundreds of quotes from all these socialists, etc. And he goes into explaining about the three phases: the phase of the honeymoon phase, the whole thing today with the second phase where they start to go into this stage of all the excuses and that, and then entering the third phase, there's a moment of silence and then distancing themselves and then turning around and saying, oh well, that wasn't the true face of socialism. When you go through the honeymoon phase of each socialist regime throughout history, whether it was the 1930s of the Soviet Union, the socialists would proudly, boastfully, claim, oh, it's the greatest thing in the world, oh, this is what every other country should be emulating. There was 70,000 people sitting in concentration camps. They claimed that they were happy and peaceful and all the rest of this. Look, folk, they were brutally murdered. In other words, socialism creates a problem in the economy. There's failure of socialism. So rather than just holding their horns up like any normal person would and say, okay, it doesn't work, they would try to find the scapegoat. They would try to find just some innocent person, just try to pass the blame off elsewhere. One of these things that they don't ever want to accept reality, because to accept reality is essentially to say, okay, I have to hold my hands up and say it doesn't work. And they would use up all the excuses because, again, it's a case of finding a scapegoat. Everything's an excuse for socialism because socialism to them comes above absolutely everything. It doesn't matter how many people lose their lives, socialism means more to them than all that. It is not until the failure becomes so obvious. Well, it's not to say that it wasn't in the 1930s anyway, but it's when it gets to the stage where it's so extreme that it's impossible for them to ignore. Then the second phase comes around with all the excuses and stuff like that. Oh, it just, it wasn't done in the right way. It's a case that they failed socialism and socialism didn't fail them. Because let's face it, socialists have not got a clue about why socialism fails, why it was socialism that failed them, why it was socialism that would inevitably lead to them becoming the dictatorship, right? It's not like they didn't try socialism. Of course they tried socialism. They wanted to reach the end goal, but they couldn't. Now, the economic reality is exactly what I'm talking about with the consequences that they're faced with. And instead of them accepting the reality of economics, it's a bit like somebody that's trying to argue with biology. They think they can argue with all sorts. They think they can argue with the laws of economics. For example, they honestly seem to think that the laws of supply and demand can be just bat aside and as if it just doesn't even exist. How you can tell they're trying to argue with the laws of supply and demand is they think that they can argue that the minimum wage can work. It doesn't matter how often that the laws of supply and demand contradicts it. They still persist on doing the same thing and or because they honestly don't want to accept economic facts and reality. It's like, listening to Robert Reich. A normal person would sit and think to themselves, well, why did the shortage problems occur? And then a normal person would be open-minded, and if someone like me says to you that price ceilings caused shortage problems, you would be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, why does it cause shortage problems? I want to learn that. I want to go away and independently research that. See, a socialist doesn't do that. A socialist is not interested in the logic. A socialist is not interested in learning for the cause of the problem, because these are the same people you hear constantly telling you, oh, it's the sick, the needy, the poor, the disabled, and all the rest of this. Oh, it's the homeless people, it's all this, that, and the next thing. You come to learn, folk, that all that is just a front. It's the case that you see the socialism as a failure today. It's been a failure for decades. The NHS has never worked a single year in its entire history. Okay, socialism's a failure, but I wouldn't say that's the worst part of socialism. The worst part of socialism is the level of denial. Regardless of how poor it gets, people are still making up excuses for it, because when it comes down to the NHS and you see all the long waiting lines and all sorts, and you know, the shortage problems, the surplus waste problems, all that, all they want to do is use up excuse after excuse after excuse. For example, saying that the NHS is underfunded, as if to say they can continue on doing the free at the point of use. Somehow they expect to manage it properly. There's a lot of folk who are even within the conservative movement who don't even understand socialism. They don't, let's be honest with you. They really don't. They're clinging on for dear life to things like the state-run fire service, and they honestly think it can somehow outperform that of a free market. There is no such thing as libertarian socialism or democratic socialism. And I've said this so many times over because it's important that folk understand this. What do you want to do? Do you want to have a moneyless based system like the Marxist theory, where it's moneyless and classless and apparently stateless? Let's destroy that argument first and foremost. If they want a moneyless based economy, what they're essentially telling you is they don't understand the very reason why money came to existence in the first place. Money is not a means of wealth. In other words, earning a lot of money isn't wealth. Wealth is what you call the material possessions that you own and you possess and you're able to buy. That's what your wealth is. Money is really just just a case of, it's the means of exchange. Now, how you know that they've no got a clue about money in history is because the reason for why money came to existence is because how else are you going to trade? All trade is part of capitalism. It's the very reason why if you shut off trade, if you get rid of capitalism, there's no money coming in and out of the country, right? That's one of the big things that socialists don't understand about socialism. The reason why I bring up that is because it used to be a case where it was a barter system. A barter system didn't work. It was irrational, but at the time you've got to remember that was way back in, thousands of years ago. Barter where maybe a farmer has cows and chickens, and let's say you applied that same, barter system to today's economy. Well, how's a farmer going to get a television? Well, first of all, the farmer's going to try and find a vendor who sells televisions. He needs to find a willing vendor. Who's to say that the vendor who sells televisions wants to exchange his televisions for cows and chickens? Socialists are so one-track minded, they just assume that, but the cows and chickens means food, and so they, just take that, and it's like, well, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that he's going to, make that exchange, right? He could get food elsewhere for all we care, right? And he might not even want that in particular, and at that given time, or they don't even think about all these complexities. They don't think in more than one direction. The farmer's going to have to go through all the bother just to try and find whoever it is, a willing vendor that would be willing to take the cows and chickens for the sake of, a television. So that was the reason for why money came to existence, like gold and silver, because it was something universal. And plus the fact gold and silver would be intrinsic, it would hold its value. Unlike if you made, for example, food's got a sell-by date. It doesn't last long. So really that's all the money was, and that's why money came to existence. It was universally agreed upon, and it wasn't something forced upon the market. It was just something that naturally came around. It was something that would fix a problem. that would enable people to trade across the world, and you get the point of where I'm coming from. It enabled people to do business and be able to exchange with one another. So that's the first thing. That's how you know that those who are arguing for this moneyless based economy are just utopian, that don't live in the real world. They don't understand the importance of why money exists for the sake of exchange. So when it comes down to this today with the monetary issue, socialists don't understand that money can only come from two places, and that's a simple fact. Socialists don't understand that the public sector can't finance itself. You require money coming from somewhere to pay for the public sector. In other words, the public sector doesn't generate enough to pay for itself, so the public sector pays what you call a rebate. It doesn't pay taxation. Socialists think it's a case that taxation and a rebate are the same thing, and it's no. A rebate simply means that the public sector is paying a percentage back to the government for what government initially gave them in the first place. After all, who do you think pays the public sector their wages? It's the government. Government's the one that's paying 100% of their wages. Now, socialists might say, well, okay, then that's not a problem. Well, of course there's a problem, because you then follow up with the question, where's the government getting the money for in order to pay their wages? It's a case that where government gets the taxation from, the government more or less stealing from the private sector taxpayer. I know socialists don't like that one, but so that's the first place the money comes from. But we know for a simple fact that these socialists want to get rid of the private sector. Whenever, people pull the likes of Jeremy Corbyn up, these, socialists of the Labour Party who basically want to nationalise this, that and the next thing. That's the very reason why they ask the question, well, okay then, that's all well fair said and done. Where are you going to get the money for to pay for all that? That is to say that the bigger the public sector grows, the less the size of the private sector's left. You're obviously going to end up to a certain point where there's no enough taxpayers' money to pay for a massive big bloated public sector. So they don't think about that. So if you're not going to get it for the private sector, where are you going to get the money for? And this is where it comes down to the printing press. Again, because socialists don't understand the laws of supply and demand. And this doesn't just apply to Marxists. This applies to, you've probably heard of these modern monetary theorists. They aren't something new. The MMT, or that today we are Marxists, they think it's just a case that you can run the printing press and who cares, as if to say inflation's a good thing. To understand the fundamental basics, the greater the supply that you've got of something, the less demand you've got for it, because there's more of it to go around. It's the same principle with production, it's the same principle with money, it's the same principle with anything. That is to say that the shorter the supply you've got available, and someone actually used the example of baseballs, or you could use the example of playing football, like of course a bag of footballs available and they kick the ball and it goes into the bush or something, they can't find it, they're looking for the football despite the fact they've kicked it into the bush. You know how many times that's happened. However, they've got less demand for it because the fact they've got a whole bag full of the footballs. And let's say they've not got a bag of footballs, let's say that was the only football they had and they kicked the ball and it went into the bush and it went missing. Well, obviously that person's going to have a greater demand for that one football because that was the only one they had. That is to say, the greater the supply that you've got of something, the less demand that you've got for it. That's common sense, right? It's the same thing if you walk into a shop. The more and more bottles of water that you're going to put in your basket, the less demand you've got for it, right? Because the more water you put into it, it's the law of diminishing value. That is to say, the more that you put in your basket, the less value you had for it because you've already got enough. Robert P. Murphy, he does an excellent example about, going on holiday and he takes his dog with him and his dog ends up knocking the dish over and, that's one bottle down and there's one less and therefore he's got to then compromise. When you're running the printing press, it's every $1 and £1 or €1, it doesn't matter what it is, to the value of one product. So in 1913, $1 was equal to that of one product. The problem is that for every $1 that they would print in circulation, there's one plus debt added to the currency, because what you're doing is that for every $1 you're printing, there's more and more and more of that paper available in circulation, so it becomes less and less scarce, the less value that currency holds. So that's why Venezuelan people were dumping the currency a large quantity. You may as well use it as toilet paper. It's not so much that the price of your goods and services are gone up, it's the fact that there's more and more of that paper chasing the goods. There's more of that paper in circulation than that of what the goods are available. How else are they going to pay for their massive big bloated public sector? How else are they going to pay for all their socialism? Well, they've got no other option. Their only option is to run the printing press. They obviously don't understand the laws of supply and demand, that the more that they print, the more the inflation drives up, because that's what inflation is, folk. Inflation is like the balloon. The more and more air that you pump into the balloon, the more the balloon blows up in size. Well, it's the same thing with the currency. That's what inflation really is. And therefore, the less scarce the paper becomes and the less value the purchasing power holds. And if you've got less purchasing power of your currency, the less you can buy with it. The other part of the problem in economic reality, right? So the first thing, they're going to need to try and get rid of the private sector to some extent. And so you've got consequences. Whole issue where every single time they end up pitting their foot in it and inflation soars out of control, what is it that socialists always try to do? Costs of living, super high, prices and everything due to the inflation, right, that they created. How convenient that they essentially created. It's like one big comedy show watching them. Price fixing. They do it every single time, folk. You don't even need to look at a Marxist for the sake of this. Look at, for example, the Scottish National Party, along with that of the Green Party, who are a bunch of commies. Look closer to him. Not long ago, I was hearing about how Nicola Sturgeon was wanting to set down rent controls, which is a price ceiling. Price ceiling simply means that the government's going to take the super high price because rented housing is so expensive. So what does the government try to rectify the problem by doing? They try to artificially, and the key word there is artificially, and artificially drives it down and sets a maximum so that the price doesn't go above the maximum, right? It's a price ceiling. What the price ceilings always result in is what you call a price shortage problem. Because when you artificially lower the price, what do you think happens when price goes down? Consumer demand drives up. That's natural. You see it on sales. You see it with Black Friday. What I'm giving you as an example, when inflation's already soared out of control, right, and governments try to fix the problem, socialists try to fix the problem of the soaring prices, what do you think socialists are going to do? Set down the price ceiling. So they artificially lower the price. Demand soars and it makes the shortage problem even worse. Because what is a higher price in the market? A higher price is a price signal to say, here as well there's a shortage. That is to say that a higher price serves its purpose to ration scarcity. Now, I seen an article the other day that I shared, and the article was something to do with a current event. Now, I'm a massive Rangers supporter. I love my club. We've just reached the Europa League final, and folk are wondering why the hell that you've got an issue to do with basically expensive costs of the hotel prices. It's not because they're greedy. These newspaper articles are putting out this utter nonsense to folk, and people are going away believing it. It's not because of greed. It's not a totty day with greed. It's because if demand far exceeds the supply of placements available in those hotels, then the price is naturally going to drive up, because it's the only way that you can ration what is scarce. Then trying to fix a problem that they created with another problem by artificially lowering the price, they really are like a circus show. They then project the blame off elsewhere and say, oh, you're greedy. That is them to a T. They never want to take personal responsibility. They don't want to ever accept that they were the problem to begin with. In order for you to get rid of the private sector, as I says, you're going to need to use force, right? Well, they're going to have to face up against a very angry population of people, and you saw that in Great Britain prior to Margaret Thatcher. The soaring inflation, pointing the finger at her and saying, oh, she's so evil, man, she brought forward privatisation, she's destroying the economy. You're sitting thinking to yourself, dear God, man, all of this because folk just don't understand economics. In order for government to get to where it wants in terms of trying to get rid of the private sector, it's committing economic suicide. It either continues on down the road of this economic catastrophe and the population grows ever more angrier, and therefore the angrier the population grows due to the soaring inflationary problems and everything as a result of that. This is why it requires a specific type of character. It requires the type of socialist to carry on socialism. That is to say that in order for a socialist to reach the end goal of that heavy nationalisation, of nationalising this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing, they would have to completely ignore the aggressive population and the inflation that led to that. Right? The inflation that led to the aggressive population. So what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to, continue on doing what they're doing. They're going to have to be a Nicolas Maduro, in other words, and just continue on doing this, that, and the next thing, and completely ignore the uprising behind them. Buildings on fire and all sorts, a big pile of dead bodies and everything. They're going to have to ignore basically the reality of what's behind them to continue on with socialism, to try and reach the end goal. But this is the point that socialists don't understand. Socialists are looking at that and they're thinking to themselves, oh, it's them who failed socialism. No, it's not them who failed socialism. It's a case that was part of the economic reality. That was part of, well, what were you expecting? You're cutting off the very sector that finances the economy. You're cutting off the sector where the taxpayer comes from, and you're running the printing press. That was going to happen. When it comes to that type of socialist who's going to have to ignore all the aggressive population, that's why the inevitable consequence is to reach that end goal of the heavy nationalisation where you abolish the entire private sector, you've only got one type of character that can take you there, a dictator. That's it. When they argue to you from a hypothetical fairy tale, and it's never is a fairy tale, when they argue to you about, they'll just nationalise everything and somehow, as if by magic, the state will just wither away. That isn't the real world, folk. How's the state just going to wither away? And if it does, how then are you going to keep everybody in the one page? Now, what was it that Karl Marx argued? Karl Marx said in his own words, you require the dictatorship of the proletariat. What was he meaning by that? You reach that end goal where the private sector's been completely abolished. Karl Marx acknowledged the human nature, the reality of human beings, that we are self-interested. This was the very reason why the argument of the new man came around. They knew that they could not reach the end goal, the so-called utopia of socialism, without trying to change mankind. And the consequences of that was many millions of people were wiped off the face of this earth. Karl Marx was basically saying to you, okay, we acknowledge the remnants. I'm not saying the capitalist system's in place, but he's saying the remnants of capitalism is still there. That is to say that human beings are naturally self-interested. We're naturally individualist. We're naturally all different from one another. Karl Marx, in his own words, was telling you, we need the dictatorship of the proletariat. So what he's saying is, you require a dictatorship to keep them all on the one page, because if you've got no government, right, and you've got a population, let's say, of Great Britain, of 65 million people, how the hell are you going to create your egalitarian utopia of equality? That's all socialists going about. Don't ever let them try to change the subject and try to deny that. That is what socialism's about, because it's all you ever hear from them. And what do you require to try and achieve equality across the whole of society? Well, you're going to need to try and control people, ain't you? And what's control? Control is the antithesis of liberty. Apparently we all derive from apes, and therefore we were all the same, apparently, in their logic. And because we were all the same, this is what they want to try and get us back to. Socialists have turned around and said to me that, the only reason why people are different from one another is because they were indoctrinated that way since birth. And therefore it was their parents that indoctrinated them to be different or something like that. And it's just like, these socialists live so far from reality. They're so dangerous. They don't understand reality of human beings, of who we are. They don't accept you for who you are. And when they can't control you, they get aggressive, right? They've got no concept, no understanding of human nature and reality. And you saw that with Chaz, the capital autonomous zone. If that was not a warning to you folk, and they used up excuses to say, oh, that wasn't us trying and testing it was, right? For the get-go it was, and they tried their wee utopian, childish nonsense. You saw it with our childish, infantile, commie farm, and that they've never lived the real world. They've got no concept of even agriculture, of the concept of how much hard work it requires for farmers. It's not just a case of, oh, they just plant things and within, a couple of days they've got food and voila. They don't even understand that farming is something seasonal. If that doesn't tell you how far removed from reality they really are, then that should just say everything, right? And the other issue, and part of that correlates, that I already mentioned in my recent video, I mentioned that if you've not got private property, you do not have your individual rights. Your individual rights are gone, therefore you've got no private property rights. And private property rights don't just cover the sake of your private property, as in your private land or as in your private business. Your private property rights also protect you for the possessions that you buy. Your private property rights are going to protect you for what you own, because if somebody tries to steal your possessions, you've got your rights there to protect you, to then take them to government, to take them to court or whatever it is, and say, this person's tried to steal fares, this is my possession, you can see here for the evidence, it's my possession, they've tried to steal fare, you can take them to court and you can get them done for it. They're so clueless that they think they can have, without private property rights, individuals in society just all coming together, holding hands together, and they'll somehow all share with one another and they can have their personal ownership of possessions. They really are infantile. If there's no government, who's going to stop someone like me starting up a private business? Or who's going to stop any other photographer or any other person? Well, they're going to need the dictatorship of the proletariat to try and keep them on the one page, and there you go. Socialism can't avoid the totalitarianism. That's why when they go on about their workers' co-ops, they're going to need a price structure. And therefore, inevitably, they're going to need capitalism to uphold something like that, right? Because let's face it, not only are they faced with the personal ownership of possessions problem, because they need private property rights, so again they're going to have to leech off of capitalism in order for that to exist, but also the economic calculation problem. Again, folk, you can check out my videos on the economic calculation problem that explain all of that, but if you've not got the information of profits and losses, if you've not got the information of market-driven prices, that is to say, information of consumers driving what prices are, then you do not hold the information of consumers' needs and wants. You're dealing with people who are so far removed from reality, and you're never going to get through to them. And it's like I says, people who support the mixed economy, they're making just as much as a mistake as that of the socialists themselves. Because again, you're faced with the economic calculation problem, etc. It would never rival a free market in healthcare, fire service, education, etc, etc. So I hope that pretty much covers everything relative to the question you had. And of course, thank you for watching. If you've got anything that you would like to ask, I'll try and get back to you. And obviously, be sure to like the video, share the video. And of course, like I say, I'll try and respond. I think I've covered the basis of everything of socialism in a nutshell. That's essentially why you're always going to be faced with it. It's the very reason why when you saw Venezuela end up in the food shortage crisis, the blackouts, etc., all socialists could do is, instead of staring in the face of all those poor people, resorting to eating zoo animals and stuff like that, endangered zoo animals, instead of socialists acknowledging how much they're suffering, all they could do was use up excuses to cover up for the failure of socialism, which tells you that their feelings for socialism means a lot more to them than people's own lives at risk. And if that doesn't tell you something about those sort of people, what does, folk? Talk to yous later.